What's up, everybody? Wanted to speak a little bit with you today about Bitcoin. I wanted to talk about Bitcoin from a few perspectives that are non-traditional, that are even perhaps non-financial or non-economic, that might be considered more naturalistic, that might be considered more evolutionary or physical, as opposed to the much more economically or financially driven narratives that pervade the vast majority of discussion on Bitcoin today. So, while those are useful and while those discussions are interesting from a fairly zoomed in perspective in terms of trying to understand the economics of Bitcoin, the microeconomics especially of Bitcoin, what makes Bitcoin tick, what is the low-level game theory of Bitcoin in terms of its actual instantiation in our economic daily lives. And it's pretty easy to get a grasp on at that level because that's the level we usually interact with these types of new technologies. I'd like to zoom out a bit. I'd like to take things from the very low-level tangible economic realities that we often discuss and that we often focus upon, especially around price and especially upon the utility of Bitcoin as a means of exchange or store of value. All of these worthy discussions that are interesting and provide a lot of information, and zoom out to something that's a much more pattern-oriented conversation around the evolution of this technology from a broader perspective. From a perspective of what these systems or the birth of these new systems really represent in terms of the evolution of information flow, the evolution of the way that humans are expressing value to one another, the manner in which these types of new emergent systems actually resemble certain types of physical phenomena. Today I'm going to be presenting three metaphors for those physical phenomena at the cosmological, at the geological, and at the ecological levels to try to draw some comparisons at those levels to certain things happening in the world of crypto and Bitcoin today. I know it's a bit non-traditional and it's probably going to sound a little bit different than the majority of content that's put out there in the crypto world, but that's because my perspective tends to skew towards the evolutionary and the naturalistic, towards the metaphorical and drawing analogies between these more concrete systems within our immediate economic reality and deeper systems that present themselves, or deeper patterns that present themselves within systems throughout our environment today and throughout the history of the universe. I think that by looking at these patterns and looking at how they reemerge and how these flows and these particular types of symmetries manifest themselves, we can learn actually quite a bit about the overarching pattern, the overarching flow of a system like Bitcoin and why it is emerging at the time that it is emerging and what it implies for the future of its behavior at a macro level, at a zoomed out perspective. I'm not trying to predict the prices today, tomorrow, next week, next year, even 5 years from now. I'm trying to look at the very macro resolution dynamics that are presenting themselves and giving us clues as to where the general direction of things are flowing. And this is more towards people who are interested for the sake of their own long-term financial investments, for the sake of their own perhaps just general understanding of what's going on in the world today, and especially for those who like to make comparisons or think analogically between, or across categories, across the financial or the physical, the geological categories, and just kind of find that interesting. So, without further ado, let's get into this. I would like to start first by talking about the cosmological lens. And through the cosmological lens, I've been thinking a lot about Bitcoin as an event that's something like the creation of a new star. And if you think about the creation of a new star, what you have is a lot of different types of low, basically periodic number elements, light gases, who are coming together or being forced together, drawn together by gravity. And after a particular density density threshold is hit, after enough gas is compressed, after enough energy is compressed by its own gravity to a very small space, there's a fusion event. It actually generates nuclear fusion, and that generates a chain reaction. And that chain reaction in the star creates a effectively self-reifying or self-sustaining nuclear reaction that generates a sun, our sun, or a star in general. And that star is then able to not only have a stable gravitational field around it, or does it create a stable gravitational field around it, it also is able to now act as a source of energy to sustain an entire set of dynamics around it. So what does this have to do with Bitcoin? Okay. When we think about Bitcoin, Bitcoin was actually a reaction to what happened in the markets in 2008. It's not only that, it was a reaction also to many different events that have happened throughout economic history and led different thinkers, particularly in the Austrian School of Economics, to question the wisdom of particular aspects of monetary strategy, in which we had far more centralized control over the mechanisms by which the flow of money, or the money supply, was governed in our society. And so you can kind of look at it as this historical period, in the same way that the gases in the star, or the gases aggregate or accumulate because of gravitational attraction before the creation of a star. There was simultaneously this historical progression of kind of economic, ideological, philosophical gases swirling and increasingly becoming more and more dense as people realized that the centralized control of monetary systems introduced increasing levels of instability and unstable feedback over time, and that it was particularly naive to think that we were able to control those market cycles, or control those periods of volatility, those crashes, those booms and busts, through the very inadequate lens or levers provided to, for example, the Federal Reserve. And that was one element of that. That was one set of these gases. Another set of gases, argues around the necessity of hard money, the necessity of actually binding our representations of value to something other than our own desire to manage the system, which is kind of what we have now with the Federal Reserve System. It's actually, our monetary systems are not backed by anything other than promises, anything other than trust, anything other than a story. And when it ultimately bottoms out in something, it bottoms out in coercion and force, as opposed to any physical substance that could be pointed to as the thing that is attached to the representation of value, the fractionated representations of value. And so that's another cloud of this other thought that was out there, these other people who are unhappy with the way things were evolving. If we look at the kind of evolution of our monetary system and our historical system, and there were multiple other reasons why people were not exactly happy with the way that our monetary system and our government systems of governance were interacting and feeding back upon one another. Some of those are beyond the scope of this video, but that's kind of the background. These are these swirling clouds of gases increasingly creating a denser, more energetic, higher gravity area of ideological thought, of new ideas that were coalescing and increasingly coming into contact with one another. And then the financial crash happened, or the mortgage-backed securities crash of 2008 occurred. And that is extremely relevant because that is quite a bit like the nuclear fusion event in a star. That is the event that all of these elements, all of these philosophical and economic threads throughout history came together in a point where the rest of the world also realized just how true some of these arguments were, just how unstable or fragile our economic systems actually were, given their high levels of interconnection and the way that the decisions of people who thought they were in control could feed back on one another in ways that created these systemic cascades that made everyone vulnerable to the decisions, the poor economic decisions, the poor risk evaluations of a few bad actors within the system. It was, as someone like Nassim Taleb would call it, an extremely fragile system that we had created over time. And so that moment of realization was a fusion event. It was the event that triggered the creation of the star that is Bitcoin. And the star that is Bitcoin is now a engine, a actual runaway reaction that is able to actually create an entirely new economic solar system, so to speak. So perhaps before we had a single star, we had effectively this fiat system of currency that was the default energy flow source in our entire solar system of value. And because of the historical issues that I just talked about and just mentioned, we actually got a very unusual event. We actually got the birth of a new star within our own solar system. So that event means that now we have, and it's a smaller star now, it's a smaller star than our sun. Or it's a smaller star, the Bitcoin star is a smaller star than the fiat star, right? But there's also reciprocity between these two stars. There's actually now an energy flow between these two stars. And there are ecologies, or there are solar systems around each of them, right? So if you can imagine, the old fiat star has all of the traditional planets of the financial institutions with whom it has established these reciprocal energy flow relationships. Now, I know that generally there's not a reciprocity of the energy flow between a star and planets, but for the sake of argument, you can kind of think of these institutions having settled into stable orbit around this system of fiat currency. And now we have a new star. We have the Bitcoin star. And the Bitcoin star is able to create, not only it has now entered into a binary relationship. So you have a binary system now of the fiat system and this Bitcoin system that are actually competing for resources, energy. They're competing for the same finite sphere of attention, for the same trust, really, is this fundamental resource that they are competing for. It's the trust of all of the planets in the systems. And so what's going on, what we're actually beginning to see in the emerging crypto community, and this applies to all cryptos. This applies to altcoins as well as it applies to Bitcoin. This applies to Ethereum as well as any other altcoin out there. Those coins, whether people think it or not, those coins are in orbit around the Bitcoin star. They have their own independent realities. They, in the same way, they have their own different relative sizes. Sometimes they think that they are independent and that they could survive on their own. But the reality of this is that the creation of the star was a one-time event, at least for the time being. It's not actually something that can be easily replicated because it required that confluence of many different factors, cultural, economic, and the acute issue or the acute pain of that 2008 event to trigger the fusion reaction that created the trust anchor, what has been called trust anchor in an essay that I will link below in the notes, of this entire ecosystem. And it's not just the trust anchor of the Bitcoin world, it is the trust anchor of the entire crypto economic world. If you think that the rest of the crypto economic ecosystem would survive if Bitcoin collapsed, it would not. It would be a supernova event, and it would destroy basically the entire crypto economic system, the foundations of trust, which are the fundamental foundations that were able to actually come together to support the creation of the new Bitcoin star would be blown out from underneath the system, and humanity would, we would perhaps find other ways of incorporating some of those lessons, but it would most likely occur within the auspices or of the state systems that we know today. We would see perhaps people trying to attempt to create new systems to reemerge from that, but most likely now that the kind of gig is up, governments understand what to look for. If they knew that today would, that Bitcoin would have turned out as it is, if they had taken Bitcoin seriously early enough, it's quite likely that they never would have allowed it to get to where it's gone today. They didn't act quickly enough to kind of snuff it out, to kind of diffuse those gases that have been accumulating into the primordial dense gas cloud or the plasma cloud that eventually became the Bitcoin star. And so now we're in this space where the Bitcoin star is actually, a sustainable fusion reaction. And we are trying to figure out how long it's going to take for the various elements in orbit around this fiat star to move over into orbit around the Bitcoin star. And it's a binary star system. So the Bitcoin star and the fiat star are rotating around one another. They're actually trying to find some sort of homeostatic equilibrium, some sort of relationship that is stable between them. And that's an interesting question. The question is it actually stable? Is there a transference of energy, a net transference of energy from the system of the fiat currency world into the world of Bitcoin? And the obvious answer is yes, because where else would that money have come from, or that value have come from? Some of that trust, some of that value is flowing from one to the other. So the question is, what is the rate? How stable is this orbit? How stable is this binary system? Will one consume the other, right? And this is the position of a extreme Bitcoin maximalist, is that the new Bitcoin star will grow rapidly enough or display enough enough properties of value that would actually attract effectively over time every single planet that was in stable orbit around the fiat star. And so that's kind of like the cosmological lens, the very macro lens through which I would kind of think about this evolution of Bitcoin, this creation of Bitcoin on the scene. It is very much like the creation of a star. It is one of these things that it takes a confluence of many factors, and it is unlikely that it can easily happen again if this whole system collapses. And if it does collapse, it will also likely take all of the things that are in its orbit with it. So that would be the first layer. That would be the most macroscopic layer of this set of metaphors, cosmological layer. Okay, next layer is the geological layer. So when I'm thinking about the geological layer, I'm trying to basically zoom in a little bit more to kind of express different properties of Bitcoin than I was expressing in the initial conditions of the Bitcoin economy that I was expressing in the cosmological layer. When we go into the geological layer, what we're actually really trying to understand to some extent is the way that changes in the world of Bitcoin propagate outwards into other systems, and how the element or the behavioral tendencies or the behavioral properties of Bitcoin constrain or impact the properties of the rest of the entire space. So, and the crypto space to be specific. So what I'm thinking here is that I would like to make the assertion that the Bitcoin layer is something like the plate tectonic layer. There's something like a very deep structural layer within the Earth's core. It is effectively these very low-level dynamics whose interactions will reverberate upwards and shape the entirety of the rest of the surface of this planet, this emerging planet of crypto. So now we've switched from the star metaphor to just a planet. So just bear that in mind. We're not talking about, Bitcoin is actually no longer the sun. We're talking about a different context. So what is happening here within this layer is that the ecology, everything on the surface, everything that you interact with in a context of a high time preference, the things that are happening quickly in the day-to-day markets, the things that are actually, the things to which the economic agents, such as individuals starting companies or ICOs occurring, all of these are happening at much more surface level layers. And what's happening deeper in the structural landscape is, the actual evolution of the technology of Bitcoin. And in the same way that low-level plate tectonic shifts can propagate outwards and take some time to do so, or the effects of the plate tectonic shifts propagate outwards at different rates, perhaps, right? So like in the same way that, you might have two tectonic plates and they'll shift against one another, and that immediate shift that has been a bunch of built up tension between the two will shift. And when they shift like that, it'll very quickly radiate out the actual seismic activity, the waves within the crust of the earth that create, tsunamis, earthquakes, these very large, very obvious effects on the surface, perhaps very destructive effects on the surface. And these would be things like forks in actual Bitcoin. These would be things like a lot of the dialogue and rhetoric around whether or not there will be a Bitcoin ETF. These are these types of actions that are these low-level structural or meaningfully structural actions that immediately resonate and reverberate outwards. There are also much slower actions in progress. There are actions such as, plate tectonics. When one plate will basically go underneath another plate and create a mountain range, and that mountain range could effectively, it doesn't happen quickly, but it also creates a dramatic aspect of the landscape, right? So these are much slower shifts that are going to, in theory, shape the eventual ecology. And people will most likely forget or no longer think about the things that happened today or yesterday or a year ago with respect to their significance on constraining what is possible today. In the same way that we rarely, if ever, and all other animals never, sit around thinking about how the mountains or the beaches or the canyons around us are actively shaping what is possible, or actively shaped the ecologies from which many of the extant species on planet Earth emerged. So that's this tectonic layer. It's like there's basically this deep strata of fundamental changes, proposals, development going on in this deep economic strata, or this deep Bitcoin strata. And everything else, once again, is stacked atop that. And we are creating ecological niches. Niche ecologies are springing up atop, on the surface level of the planet. And yet they're not in any way disconnected from Bitcoin, in the same way that the surface of the planet is not disconnected from the core of the planet. What happens in the core of the planet affects everything. And that's not going to change. I think people are wondering when there's going to be this decoupling event, and between Bitcoin and all of the altcoins, when we will see their paths split, and see no longer will we observe correlations in their movement. And it's very unlikely to me that that's going to happen in any meaningful way with the coins that we see now. Any coins that are actually, in theory, supposed to be an actual currency that's actually supposed to be something that's more of like an ecology, so like a Ethereum or an EOS or anything that's trying to create its own ecological, large-scale ecological niche, those aren't going to decouple from Bitcoin. They can't, in the same way that you can't decouple the continent of North America from the activity of the core. Now, if you're small enough, if you're talking about something that's an eventual niche, we're talking about task-specific tokenization of assets, tokenization of specific human values within, microeconomic ecologies. That would be something more akin to whether or not a specific neighborhood is impacted by a specific earthquake. And as you can see in our normal world, yes, there are many neighborhoods in the world that aren't affected by the majority of earthquakes. And so there will definitely emerge niches that are disconnected from the dynamics of Bitcoin, but that will largely be a function of their specificity and their relatively localized utility. Anything that claims to be generally useful, anything that claims to have general purpose economic utility, or to create some sort of actual large-scale ecosystem of distributed application development, a world computer, anything like that, it's not going to decouple. They are not going to decouple because Bitcoin is the fundamental plate tectonics underlying this entire system. And so that brings us to the most zoomed in layer of what's going on right now, which is going to be perhaps the most specific part of this talk, just because it is the most micro scale. It is the highest granularity actions, the most relatable, because it's the thing that's most like what's happening in our day-to-day perspective, our day-to-day evolutionary frame that we're used to thinking about. The brain understands that the sun goes up and the sun comes down. The brain understands the period in between eating meals. The brain doesn't grasp as easily changes that are happening on these much larger, much deeper time frames. So this is probably going to be a little more familiar. Okay, and this is the ecological niche. This is the ecological metaphor in terms of what's going on with respect to Bitcoin right now. And we'll first start by putting this hypothesis out there that Bitcoin is kind of like the trees in a forest. And we'll go from there. So why is Bitcoin like a tree? So in the same way that a tree takes energy from the sun and converts that energy into CO2 and sugar, oxygen and sugar, in the same way that you have that conversion process and some other byproducts, Bitcoin is taking energy from basically the human production of energy, the human output of energy, and it is actually taking that energy and codifying it and storing it into a representation that maps to the underlying value of the production of that energy, which is a very deep, it's a very deep statement about human value, right? Energy is in everything. Energy flows through every aspect of our daily lives. It's requiring energy for me to make this film. It requires energy for me to eat. It requires energy for anybody to do effectively anything at any time, anywhere, because everything is fundamentally subject to this conservation of energy. And so we're just moving energy around from one place to another, but it matters how we're actually transforming it. It matters what the energy is being encoded into. And so for trees are interesting because they will basically, use their ability to photosynthesize to encode energy into these sugars, and those sugars are actually then in the root systems traded with the fungal networks, with the mycelial networks in the root systems for smaller micronutrients that those trees don't produce themselves, and their roots, and for which their roots are too big to absorb or to obtain efficiently. And so what you actually see is a tiered or layered economic network emerge around this ecology, this forest ecology, this this system of a tree using its ability to convert light energy into a physically exchangeable form, and then that physically exchangeable form that is perhaps too low resolution and too slow for certain needs of the tree is used in an exchange network with a larger system, which is the mycelial system, the fungal system, and then the soil. It's used in an exchange network with that layer to dramatically amplify the capacity of the tree system, of the root system. And what I'm talking about right now is the evolutionary phase at which Bitcoin finds itself, which is the creation of a second tier network, the Lightning Network, for those of you who are not familiar. For those of you who are not familiar, the Lightning Network is very much like the mycelial or fungal network is to the trees, except to Bitcoin. Lightning Network maps to Bitcoin by effectively extending Bitcoin's deep-rooted ability to make this conversion of energy via a very trustworthy mathematical system into units of transferable account, and then build another ecology on top of that and have that be fundamentally symbiotic, a fundamentally positive sum ecology that exponentially extends the adaptive capacity and the utility of the trees, the resilience of the trees. And so what we're seeing with the Lightning Network is the emergence of that much more fine-grained, high-resolution mycelial network of value. And that's an amazingly, you can't overstate the importance of this paradigm. You cannot overstate the importance of the Lightning Network to the ecology of Bitcoin. And it is also useful to point to the fact that nature found a symbiotic solution that is very similar to the solution of actually creating a second tier. So for those who hold animosity or argue with the core devs about this decision, I would say that nature is also on their side. And I would say that it's most likely that the evolutionary experimentation that has occurred to solve problems like this has probably experimented with more hypothetical options than could any single group of engineers on the planet today. And because of that, I think that the symmetry between what I see in nature in terms of tree roots and mycelial extensions of those tree roots' capacity, because of the mapping between that and what's happening right now with respect to the layered development of the mycelial or of the Lightning Network on top of the Bitcoin paradigm, I think that's a very compelling and strong argument for that long-term strategy that was decided, in the SegWit 2x debacle. And so, this would kind of put the lie to those who think that bigger blocks were the answer, right? Bigger blocks being the answer would have been something like nature trying to just create or use larger and larger sugar molecules, right? And there's a reason why nature doesn't use larger and larger sugar molecules, because the size of sugar molecules matters. The size of sugar molecules has a billion other externalities within a complex ecology. If you change the size of the sugar molecule, you are changing you're effectively taxing an immense amount of other systems and other downstream flows, just so that you can optimize for one or two dimensions within the domain of the needs of the tree. And that makes a lot less sense than allowing for a somewhat decoupled but highly aligned symbiotic relationship between two systems to emerge, which is the solution that nature found. And it found it again through human engineers and human minds who are architecting the multi-tier system of Bitcoin in this way at the moment. And so in that way, what we see in the Bitcoin ecology is, in the ecological metaphor, we see a structure, which is Bitcoin, an evolved structure or a designed structure of a way of converting energy or using the conversion of energy into verified, well-structured units of account to bootstrap and act as the fundamental driver of a layered evolution of systems that drive this pattern deeper and deeper into our human soil. And this is also a reason, in addition to being an advantage or an argument for the Lightning Network, I would argue that this is also an affirmation of the proof of work model. This is an affirmation of the proof of work model and an argument for why the proof of work model is actually not a waste of energy in any way. Because of the fact that the energy being used is being used in a way that fundamentally governs and structures human relationships along the incentive landscape lines of the energy usage market, right? So we actually fundamentally have this deeply necessary resource, which is energy. And if you can direct the flows of energy into something, you're not just directing the flows of energy into Bitcoins. What you are also doing is creating resilient, reciprocal networks of human interaction that slowly over time align themselves around these new centers of gravity, which are oftentimes these are the miners, right? These are the miners who are out there, who are creating little economic realities, economic centers of gravity with all sorts of weird little interesting relationships. Like I was just reading a story today about a Bitcoin mining rig or a large Bitcoin mining installation that's going in northern New York that's going to be effectively arbitraging Canadian electricity prices, which is kind of fascinating and kind of funny, especially given the way that Canada had tried to prevent things of that nature from occurring. But what's happening, I bring up that example because that's a micro reality in which this deep usage of energy is actually changing behavior of humans around the economic reality of the Bitcoin pattern. And by doing that, it is creating a moat. If you want to talk in kind of traditional business lingo and you want to talk about defensibility, by actually having this very real fundamental connection with energy mediated by solid mathematics, what we are actually doing is creating highly stable economic attractors that actors or the people who create these mining rigs, the people who create or invest in these real world economic situations will actually also act to defend. And will actually act to further in terms of their real vested economic interests. Now, I'm not saying that proof of stake can't work in any scenarios, that it can't provide value to the world, because I think there are definitely places in which it can. Kind of in the same way, if we go back to the tectonic metaphor, if we're talking about the fact that yes, there are ecologies, there are certain specific locations that will be immune from some activity in the tectonic layer. In that same way, here we will see that there are definitely some elements of proof of work that might be able to form localized networks of value, right? The issue with that is going to be the fact that I don't see any obvious way that proof of work algorithms will be made as economically resilient or game theoretically resilient or evolutionarily stable as those that actually require humans to sacrifice energy. And that's the interesting thing about the use of energy is it's actually a sacrifice. It's an investment. It's actually skin in the game. And for the same reasons that someone like Nassim Taleb would argue that skin in the game is essential for building anti-fragile networks that do not succumb to their own tendency to generate incentive asymmetries, actually burning energy creates much more stable and symmetric and defensible economic relationships that people are willing to actually fight for. And it's not clear to me that that is also the case for proof of stake algorithms or other ways of trying to bootstrap these ecologies into existence. It would be something along the lines of, from where would you get the inputs that you would begin to trade with the much larger ecologies of the mycelial network? Like the trees are getting it from the sun, right? They're converting the sun into the sugar, and now they have something that is valuable to the fungus, to the mycological or mycelial network. And so you can actually therefore use that as a way of exponentially expanding the capacity of this network based on the needs and relative capacities of each layer. But if you're just trying to self-start an internally consistent proof of work network, it's possible, but it's much more like trying to get something like a star started in our very first metaphor than it is like creating an incentive aligned and highly defensible economic strategy. It also breaks down because without that incentive structure, without people who have skin in the game, people will act in a very fragile manner. People will not be committed, will not remain committed because they will not actually feel that attachment to the system. They will not have actually exerted effort. They won't have actually spent anything for these large-scale airdrops that are just being airdropped into the system and then allowing for that tokenized space of inflation to try to work itself out in terms of hopefully demonstrating that the relative amount of value held within that space and their transactions amongst one another will sufficiently bootstrap a sustainable economic reciprocity, a complex reciprocity, or a stable economic ecology. While it's possible, it seems exponentially more difficult and exponentially more limited in scope. So I think that's probably where I'm going to wrap this up, because I think if I continue going on down these paths, I may just end up saying more of the things I've already said, and I think that's probably plenty to bite off for one video. So just to recap, we have the cosmological layer, in which we actually have these historical factors lead in historical and philosophical milieu, these gases in the environment brought together gravitationally and fused or activated or ignited by this event of 2008, creating a new star that is a very rare and difficult event to achieve, but it happened this one time with Bitcoin, that creating this space, the new solar space for an actual binary star system to exist. We have the fiat star and the Bitcoin star, and we're watching a dance between those two stars to understand what those economic relationships are going to look like, to understand how quickly energy will flow from one to the other, to understand if it will remain stable between those two worlds, or if one will consume the other, or one will try to destroy the other. So we have that layer going on right now, and it should be clear that Bitcoin is that sun, it is that star, and that all of the rest of the crypto space is in its orbit. Then we should go to the tectonic or the geological layer, and we can talk about how the activities in terms of the low-level changes in the landscape of Bitcoin, so whether that's code changes or proposals, or whether that is deep fundamental integrations with other parts of the economy. Those are like these tectonic shifts or tectonic movements that eventually can either quickly create large ripple events in our world, or slowly over time shape the landscape, the mountain ranges, the oceans, the canyons that will open up all of the other niches for the vast majority of other crypto plays out there. Many of which will not survive. We're already seeing many die off, which is to be expected in the evolutionary paradigm. And so that's the tectonic perspective. And then finally, we talk about the ecological perspective. And in the ecological perspective, we talked about Bitcoin as this conversion mechanism, as the tree that can take the sunlight and create something, a unit of value that actually has demand, that has some capacity to be traded for some other service, so to speak, or some other value in the broader soil economy, and therefore a large-scale reciprocal or symbiotic relationship emerge with this mycelial network. And the mycelial network, as we discussed, was the Lightning Network, and we talked also about why this why this also makes not only why this is a stronger argument for the emergence of the Lightning Network other than the block size, but also why this pattern should give us pause, at least how this pattern might help us consider the unique evolutionary characteristics of proof of stake versus proof of work at a very general level. And I know that these are probably higher level or perhaps less granular in specific economic detail as some people may like, but that's actually intentional. That's completely intentional, because the whole point of these videos are to look at the same problem through a different lens, look at the same reality of what's happening in front of us through a new perspective that allows us to perhaps draw metaphorical connections that are useful. And maybe they are, and maybe they're not. But if you found them useful, let me know. And if not, I would love to hear from you as well, and then comments below. I would also very much appreciate if any of you guys would like to donate to my Patreon page, which is Matthew Perkowski on Patreon, or patreon.com/Matthew Perkowski. I'm trying to make more of these videos, but I don't have a lot of time. So the more I can actually raise some donations there, the more I can justify actually spending time creating these, improving the quality, hopefully perhaps actually adding more graphics. I really want to make some long form videos, that less my face and more actually like narrated, well animated visualizations of some of these things. I think that could be really cool, but at the moment it's just not really in the cards, given the fact that this is just a kind of a side hobby, coming to talk to you guys about these interesting topics. So yeah, I think that's all I've got for today, and I look forward to next time. Take it easy, everybody.